The bracelet and the blanket. The rain over Seoul had not stopped in 6 hours, and Kang Min-jun had not spoken in four. He sat in the back of the car with his phone screen still lit, the photograph open, his thumb resting on the edge of it like he could hold the image in place by force alone. A woman in a white robe, standing in a doorway he did not recognize, a bundle of white blanket against her chest. 3 years he had told himself a story about this woman. Thief, traitor, a name he was not permitted to say out loud in his own house because his mother flinched at the sound of it. Now the story had a hole in it, the size of a newborn child. He told his driver to stop 2 streets early. He told his security detail to stay with the car. Kang Min-jun, the man Seoul's underworld called the Shadow King, the man 3 rival syndicate heads had tried and failed to have quietly removed from the earth, walked the last 200 meters alone in the rain, like a man half his age with none of his money. The house was small, warm light behind thin curtains, a single potted plant by the door, half drowned by the storm. He knocked once. The door opened before his knuckles found it a second time, and there she was. Amara Bennett stood in the doorway in a plain white robe, hair damp at the temples, dark circles beneath her eyes that no amount of elegance could disguise. She looked exhausted in the particular way of someone who has not slept in days, for a reason that is not sadness. In her arms, wrapped in white, a baby no more than a week old. For a moment neither of them said anything. 3 years of rehearsed anger, of speeches Min-jun had built and discarded 100 times in hotel rooms and boardrooms and the backseats of cars just like this one. All of it evaporated in the 2 seconds it took him to see her face. Because she did not look guilty, she looked terrified. His eyes dropped to the child. Dark hair, a small fist curled loose against the blanket, and around the impossibly small wrist, a thin silver bracelet, tarnished slightly at the clasp. He knew that bracelet. He had watched his mother wear it at every New Year's dinner of his childhood, before it disappeared from the family vault 9 years ago. And no one, not the private investigators, not the insurance company, not his father, had ever found where it went. "Where did you get that?" he said. Not a question, barely even a sentence. Just cold air given shape. Amara didn't answer. She held the child tighter instead, angling her body a half-inch, an old instinct returning to her spine before her mind had caught up to it. Min-jun. Her voice when it came was quiet in a way he had never heard from her, not even in the worst nights of their marriage. "You need to leave." It should have made him angrier. It did, for exactly as long as it took him to open his mouth to demand an answer. Whose child? Whose blood? What did you steal this time, Amara? What did you take from my family now? And then she said 4 words that stopped all of it. "You already know." He looked at the child again, really looked, and the ground under 3 years of certainty gave way at once. Before the door, before the bracelet, before any of it, rewind 3 years to the last ordinary night either of them would ever have. Seoul had never made room for men like Kang Min-jun to be ordinary, and Kang Min-jun had never asked it to. By 28, he was already the name whispered in boardrooms 2 seconds before a deal collapsed in someone else's favor. He had inherited his father's investment empire at 24, and with it, quietly, unofficially, the darker architecture beneath it. The network of favors, silences, and debts that kept half the city's construction permits, shipping routes, and political careers exactly where the Kang family wanted them. He was feared before he was known. That was how he preferred it. The trouble had started, as trouble in families like his always did, with a number. Kang Holdings' International Compliance Division had failed 3 consecutive audits in the space of a year, and each failure had cost the family something that mattered: a shipping license in Busan, a construction permit in Incheon, the quiet trust of a Singapore bank that had until then asked no questions about where the money came from before it agreed to hold it. Min-jun's father, aging and increasingly convinced that someone inside his own walls was bleeding him slowly rather than protecting him, had issued one order that his son considered at the time faintly ridiculous: hire someone who cannot be bought. Someone who has never wanted what we have. Amara Bennett had not come to Seoul wanting anything the Kang family had. She'd arrived from London 18 months earlier, headhunted into Kang Holdings' compliance division for the precise reason that made everyone around Minjun nervous. She asked questions no one else dared to ask, and she wrote down the answers, in ink, in files that could not later be quietly deleted. She was not impressed by the private jet. She corrected his English idiom in front of two board members during her second week, and did not apologize for it. She once told him flatly, over a contract he'd shoved across the table expecting silent compliance, that his signature line was in the wrong place and his temper wasn't a strategy. No one spoke to him like that. He found, to his own quiet astonishment, that he wanted to keep being spoken to like that for the rest of his life. Their arrangement began, in the true architecture of things, not as romance, but as proximity forced by his father's paranoia. Amara was assigned to shadow every account Minjun personally touched, an auditor with a standing invitation into rooms he had never let anyone else enter. She set her own terms from the first week. She would not sign off on anything she had not personally verified. She would not be photographed at company events as though she were decoration. And she would call him by his name, not his title, in any room without an audience, because titles were how men like him stopped hearing the truth. He agreed to all three conditions before he understood he was agreeing to fall in love with her. The thaw, when it came slowly, in the unglamorous currency of small things. A night 11 weeks into her contract, when they were both still in the office past midnight, reconciling a shipping ledger that refused to balance, and she'd produced, from nowhere he could account for, a container of jollof rice her mother had shipped frozen from London because Seoul's approximation of it never tasted right to her. "You'll hate it," she warned him, handing him a fork anyway. He did not hate it. He ate in silence for a long moment, something in his chest loosening at a taste that reminded him, absurdly, of a version of comfort he hadn't let himself want since he was a boy watching his own mother disappear into the machinery of the family business. He told her, quietly, that his mother had stopped cooking for him the year his father made him sit in on his first real negotiation, age 11, and that he had eaten catered food at his own family's table every night since. Amara did not say she was sorry for him. She simply refilled his plate, and that, more than any softer gesture might have, was what undid something in him that had been locked for 20 years. The near miss came 2 months after that, on a terrace above the city during a gala neither of them had wanted to attend, when the noise of the party below thinned to almost nothing, and Amara turned to say something sharp about the man his cousin had brought as her date and found him closer than she'd expected, close enough that whatever she'd meant to say died somewhere in her throat. His hand had found the small of her back. Her breath had gone shallow in a way she would deny to herself for a week afterward. And then his phone had buzzed violently, insistently, a message from an unknown number reading "Only ask her what she's really auditing," and the moment collapsed as fast as it had built, replaced by a silence neither of them tried to fill again that night. He never told her about the message. That silence, small and seemingly harmless, would matter more than either of them understood at the time. The public defense came 3 weeks before the wedding, at a shareholders' dinner where a board member twice Minjun's age had made a remark about compliance officers who married their way out of scrutiny, loud enough for half the table to hear, clearly meant for Amara. Minjun had stood before she could open her mouth to answer for herself, and in a voice that made the room go entirely still, informed the man that the compliance officer in question had personally found $11 million of misappropriated funds his own division had spent 4 years failing to notice, and that if he wished to discuss ethics further, Minjun would be delighted to have that conversation in front of the full board on Monday. The man did not raise the subject again. Amara said nothing to Minjun about it that night, but she held his hand under the table for the rest of the dinner, and that too was a kind of answer. They married 11 months later in a ceremony his mother did not attend and his father, silently, did. For a while, for almost a year, Kang Minjun believed he had done the one thing his family's money had never managed to buy him, a version of himself that a smart, unafraid woman could love without an agenda. Then came the terrace confession, 6 months into the marriage, on a night Amara found him sitting alone in the dark of the penthouse balcony rather than sleeping. She did not ask him what was wrong the way other people asked, expecting a lie back. She simply sat beside him and waited. My brother died on a mountain road when I was 16. He told her eventually, staring out at a city he owned pieces of and belonged to none of. I was supposed to be in the car. I had a fever that week and stayed home. My father never said it to my face, but I have spent every year since convinced he wished it had been me instead, because Taehyun knew how to be loved by people, and I only ever learned how to be obeyed. Amara had taken his hand then, not to comfort him with words, but simply to be a weight beside him in the dark, and told him, the first and only time she ever said it plainly, that she had watched him in boardrooms for a year and seen exactly the opposite. A man terrified of being loved because he had only ever been useful. It was the truest thing anyone had said to him in a decade. He did not know, sitting there, that it would also be the last wholly honest night they would ever share before the lie arrived to take its place. Then it ended like a crime scene. 6 months after the wedding, on a night that had begun with nothing more ominous than a late dinner meeting, Min-jun discovered that $14 million had been transferred from one of his private accounts into an offshore holding, registered under a name 3 shells removed from his wife's. But his forensics team traced it back to her employee credentials within 6 hours. In the same week, confidential shipping manifests belonging to one of the family's less legal enterprises surfaced in the hands of a rival organization out of Busan. Both breaches routed on paper through Amara. He never got the chance to ask her about it face to face. She was gone from the penthouse before he came home that night. Her closet half emptied, her side of the bed made with a precision that felt less like packing and more like erasing. On the kitchen counter, her wedding ring and a note in her handwriting. You were never supposed to know the truth. He read it as a confession 17 different ways over 3 years. He never once considered it might have been a warning. His mother, when he told her, said only, I warned you not to trust a woman who owed us nothing. His cousin Seo Yeon, who had quietly run the company's financial division since his father's death the year before, said less, but what little she said with a gentleness that felt, at the time, like the only kindness left in the wreckage. I never trusted her either, she told him, over tea he barely drank. I should have said something sooner. He believed her. It would be 3 years before he understood exactly what that gentleness had cost. The pregnancy test, when Amara took it 4 days after she left Seoul, was the only soft moment in a month built entirely of hard ones. She had already known by then that someone inside Kang Holdings had accessed her hospital intake forms before she'd even told her own physician she suspected she might be carrying. She had already found the black sedan that idled outside her temporary flat in Incheon for 6 consecutive nights. She had already understood, with the particular clarity of a woman who reads financial fraud for a living, that the money trail and the leaked manifests were not evidence against her. They were a costume built to fit her, stitched by someone who knew her access credentials down to the login timestamp. She had, in fact, tried once, the second night after she left, to call him. She'd stood in a stairwell with the phone against her ear for 11 rings, rehearsing the sentence, I think someone is trying to kill me, and I don't know if it's safe to say why over this line. And when he finally answered, cold and clipped and already certain of her guilt, she'd heard, in the half-second before he spoke, another voice in the background of his office. Seo Yeon's voice, low and urgent, saying something she couldn't fully make out except for one phrase that chilled her more than anything else that week. Don't let her talk her way out of this. She had hung up without saying a word. It was the last time she tried. She did not run from Min-jun. She ran from whoever had gotten close enough to frame her so precisely, and who now knew she was pregnant with the one heir who could threaten every plan they had. For 3 years, she raised the question of whether to tell him like a wound she reopened and stitched shut, over and over, in 100 rented rooms across 3 countries. Every time she got close to a phone, close to an address, close to the nerve, she remembered the black sedan and the voice in the background of that call and the man on the other end of that silence who had not once, not for 1 second, asked her why before he believed the worst. That was the wound underneath the wound. Not that he thought her a thief, that he hadn't needed proof to believe it. The child was born on a Tuesday in a small maternity clinic outside Seoul, under a name that was not Amara's own, delivered by a doctor she had vetted for 3 months before trusting. 6 hours after the birth, a nurse, kind, unremarkable, the kind of woman you would never suspect of anything, handed Amara a discharge folder containing the baby's full genetic and medical workup, standard procedure for a private clinic serving international clients. Buried in the file, beneath insurance codes and immunization schedules, was a 16-digit identification string that meant nothing to any hospital system on Earth. It meant something to Amara. She recognized the format instantly, the same encryption architecture used in the compliance audits she'd once run for Kang Holdings' legacy data servers. The kind of key that didn't belong to a hospital, the kind that belonged to an archive someone had built to survive them. She would not learn until much later whose archive it was, or why her daughter's birth had accidentally handed her the key to it. That night, she only knew one thing with total certainty. Whatever this code unlocked, someone had been waiting 3 years for a child to be born who could open it. She held her daughter and understood finally that she had never simply been running from a lie. She had been running toward the only person capable of ending it. The 3 years between that discharge folder and the doorway had not been the empty exile people imagined when they pictured a woman disappearing with a stolen fortune. There had been no fortune. There had been a rented room above a tailor's shop in Da Nang for the first winter, a job auditing invoices for a shipping firm that never once suspected what she was capable of noticing, and a second job, evenings, teaching English to the tailor's 2 daughters in exchange for a lower rent and, some weeks, a hot meal she hadn't had to cook herself. There had been a bassinet built from a dresser drawer, sanded down and painted by her own hand, because a store-bought crib meant a receipt, and a receipt meant an address. And an address was the one thing on earth she could not afford to leave behind. She had told herself, in the early months, that she would go back the moment she had proof. She had not understood then how long proof could take to surface when the people burying it controlled every system built to find it. Twice she had gotten close, an accountant in Manila who recognized the shell company structure, and agreed, for a price she barely scraped together, to trace one layer further before his own nerve failed him. A hospital records clerk in Incheon who mailed her, anonymously and at considerable risk to himself, a single printed page confirming the 16-digit code meant nothing in any standard medical database. Each fragment she gathered she sealed into the same envelope, adding to it the way another woman might have added to a scrapbook, until the evidence of her innocence had become, without her ever intending it, the only inheritance she had left to give her daughter besides a name. She had never stopped loving him. That was the part she resented most, in the small hours when the baby finally slept and the rented room went quiet enough to hear her own thoughts. Lao, she had built an entire second life out of the wreckage of the first, and somewhere underneath all of it, stubborn as a bone that had healed wrong, she still loved a man who had let a note on a kitchen counter replace 3 years of asking her a single honest question. Which brings the story back to a doorway in the rain and a man discovering that everything he'd spent 3 years believing was a costume sewn by someone else's hand. The child was born almost 3 years after Min-jun started and stopped because he could already feel the shape of the answer forming and did not want to be right. "I was pregnant when I left," Amara said. "I found out 4 days after. I didn't run from you, Min-jun. I ran from whoever inside your company was willing to frame me for theft and treason to make sure I disappeared before anyone learned I was carrying your child." He wanted, badly, to disbelieve her. Disbelief had been load-bearing in his life for 3 years. Without it, he wasn't sure what held the rest of him up. She crossed to a locked cabinet by the window, still holding the baby against one hip with the ease of someone who had long since stopped needing 2 hands for anything, and produced a thin envelope. Inside, medical intake forms with dates that made the timeline undeniable. Bank statements showing the fabricated transfer had originated from a login session recorded 30 minutes after Amara had left the building that night. A session she could not have created because she'd been in a taxi at the time, a fact the taxi company's own dispatch log confirmed, and a voice recording. His father's voice, tinny, recorded in secret, dated 11 months before his death. "If anything happens to me, don't trust the person closest to my son." Min-jun sat down on the arm of a chair he did not remember choosing to sit in. "He knew," Amara said quietly. Your father knew someone close to you was rotten years before either of us understood how deep it went. He'd been building a case. He died before he finished it. And the code, Minjun said, in her file. For the first time, Amara looked down at the child in her arms, rather than at him. She's not just your daughter. She's the key to whatever your father spent the last year of his life hiding. Someone has known that since before she was born. That's why they framed me. That's why they've been hunting us for 3 years. Her eyes came back up to his, hard now, all the terror burned off into something closer to fury. Not because I stole from your family, Minjun, because I was inconvenient to the people who did. The front door downstairs did not open gently. It came apart at the hinge, wood splintering into the hallway, and Minjun was on his feet before the sound had finished. 3 years of one identity sliding off him like a coat as the other one, the one Soul actually feared, settled into his shoulders instead. Upstairs, now. His voice left no room for the version of Amara that argued with him on principle. She went, the baby held tight to her chest, up the narrow staircase 2 steps at a time. There were 4 of them. Minjun recognized the build of the first man before he recognized the face, and recognizing the face was worse. Because it belonged to Han Do-yoon, a man who had run point on his personal security detail for 6 years, a man who had stood outside 100 rooms while Minjun slept. The fight, when it came, was short and ugly, and entirely without honor on either side. Minjun put Do-yoon down with the flat of a lamp base and a knee he would feel for a week, took a blade shallow across the forearm from the second man, and by the time the third and fourth had decided the math no longer favored them, he was alone in a wrecked living room, breathing like a man who had just understood something worse than betrayal. His own people had done this, not strangers, not a rival organization. Men who wore his family's silence like a uniform. Someone inside Kang Holdings had known in real time that he'd come to this house. His cousin Kang Seo-yeon had run the financial division since his father's death, quietly, competently, without ever once asking for the throne outright. Which was, Minjun would later understand, the entire point. She had been the one voice in his ear 3 years ago, insisting Amara couldn't be trusted, the one who'd produced the first fabricated transfer record with such clean documentation that no one had thought to question its origin. It took him 11 days of quiet excavation. Deleted security footage restored from a backup server Seo Yan didn't know existed. A hospital visitor log placing her outside Amara's Incheon clinic 3 years earlier, a pattern of wire transfers dressed up as consulting fees, to bring the evidence to her office and lay it on the desk between them without a word. She didn't deny it for long. Seo Yeon was many things, but she had never been a coward about consequences once they arrived. "I did it to protect the family," she said, and there was no tremor in it, which was somehow worse than if there had been. "You destroyed a woman's life to protect a family." "I protected it from him." Seo Yeon's composure finally cracked, one hairline fracture at a time. "Your brother." The room went very quiet. "Tae-hyun died 12 years ago," Minjun said, "the way you say something you need to hear yourself say in order to still believe it." "No," Seo-yeon said, "he didn't." Kang Tae-hyun had staged his own death at 19, walked away from a car fire on a mountain road outside Gapyeong, with a body that was not his own, and a plan that had taken 12 patient years to mature. He had built, in the shadow no one thought to check, an empire that made his younger brothers look almost respectable by comparison. Trafficking in confidential medical data laundered through shell pharmaceutical fronts, moving product and information across 3 countries under corporate names no journalist had ever thought to connect. He had also, Seo Yeon confessed with her eyes on the desk rather than on Min Jun, ordered their father's death, not out of hatred, but because their father's private investigation into the family's finances had come within one signature of surfacing Tae-hyun's entire network. And when Tae-hyun learned, through channels inside his own brother's company, that Amara Bennett was pregnant, that the coming child would carry the exact genetic authentication their father had built into a hidden data archive as a final cruel insurance policy against exactly this kind of theft. He had done what he always did. He had built a costume and put it on someone else. He needed her gone before anyone learned what the child could unlock. Seoyeon said, I gave him the paperwork. I told myself it was to protect you from a woman I genuinely believed had married you for the money. A long breath. I was wrong about her. I was never wrong about him. Min Jun thought, standing in that office, of a stairwell phone call he'd taken 3 years ago and barely remembered. A hang-up, a dial tone, a wrong number he'd dismissed within the hour because he had been too certain of his own righteousness to wonder who might have been on the other end of it. Too proud to consider that his silence that night might not have been strength at all, but the exact failure Amara had needed him not to commit. He said none of this to Seoyeon. There would be time later to understand what his own certainty had cost. Right now, there was only the shape of the danger still closing in around a house with his daughter in it. The baby disappeared on a Thursday, 11 days after the doorway, from a house Min Jun had personally reinforced with 4 men he'd vetted himself. He would learn later that vetting meant nothing when the enemy had spent 12 years learning exactly how his family verified trust. Amara's scream when she found the empty crib was a sound Min Jun would carry the rest of his life. His own reaction arrived a half-second behind hers and did not stop for the next 6 hours. Every resource his empire still possessed thrown at every hospital, airport, private clinic, and safe house within 400 kilometers, until a tip from a night nurse at a decommissioned medical facility outside the city put a location on the map. He went in alone. He had learned by now that the people who mattered most in his life kept getting hurt by the men he brought with him. Tae-hyun was waiting in what had once been an operating theater, the fluorescent lights humming over a room gone soft with dust, the baby asleep in a bassinet at his side like a chess piece. He was simply keeping warm until the game required moving it. Father built the archive so only she could open it, Tae-hyun said, without preamble, the family resemblance in his voice more unsettling than anything he'd done to earn it. Her birth records, her genetics, a failsafe so precise even I can't brute force it. I need her alive, Min Jun. That's the only reason she's still breathing. She has a name. She has a function, Tae-hyun said, and something in Min Jun that had spent 3 years mourning a marriage finally, completely, stopped grieving and started fighting instead. The 2 brothers came together in the dark of that ruined room with 12 years of buried resentment behind every blow, and for a long, close stretch of it, Min Jun was losing. His brother had spent over a decade building himself into a weapon, while Min Jun had spent his building boardrooms. A chair went over. Glass from an old instrument cabinet came down somewhere behind them. Tae-hyun had him by the collar against a wall of cracked tile, close enough that Min Jun could see, in his brother's face, the same stubborn set of the jaw their father had worn in every photograph from the years before. The business had hollowed him out, and for one disorienting second Min Jun understood that he was not only fighting his brother. He was fighting the version of himself he might have become if the fire on that mountain road had gone differently, if the fever that kept him home that night had broken an hour later, if there had been no Amara to teach him that obedience and love were not the same currency. Amara arrived before the ending could go the wrong way. She hadn't come helplessly. While Min Jun fought his brother in the dark, she had sat in a stairwell 3 floors below with a laptop and a signal booster uploading everything. The fabricated evidence trail, Seo Yeon's confession, Taehyun's shell company architecture, the entire archive her daughter's birth records had unknowingly unlocked, to 4 journalists, 2 prosecutors, and an international financial crimes task force, time-stamped and irreversible. By the time Min Jun pinned his brother to the cracked tile floor, sirens were already threading up through the building's broken windows. Taehyun's empire did not survive the sunrise. Seo Yeon turned herself in before the police reached her office, choosing, for the first time in the whole ugly architecture of it, to be the one who told the truth rather than the one who buried it. The story broke across 3 countries by noon. By the following week, the name Kang had become, for the first time in a generation, a subject of prosecutors' briefings rather than politicians' favors. Kang Min-jun walked away from the criminal half of his inheritance within the year, dismantled it piece by piece with the same cold precision his enemies had once feared, except now the precision was aimed at himself. Kang Holdings became, slowly and under considerable scrutiny, an unglamorous, legitimate company. He founded a foundation in his father's name for victims of corporate exploitation, funded largely by assets seized from his brother's collapsed network, and told no journalist the personal reason why. Amara did not come back to him right away. She let him earn it in the unglamorous currency that actually mattered, showing up to every appointment, learning to hold a screaming infant at 3 in the morning without flinching, burning eggs with a consistency that would have been comic in any story that hadn't cost this much to arrive at. He learned to recognize the particular cry that meant hunger from the one that meant nothing more than the need to be held, and he learned it not from any nanny his money could have bought him, but from failing at it in front of Amara often enough that patience became the only skill left worth having. She told him once, on a terrace overlooking a garden neither of them owned yet, "Love doesn't erase what happened. Neither does forgiveness. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen." He didn't ask her to. "I'll protect you," he said, "even if you never forgive me." She didn't, not all at once. There were nights she still flinched at the sound of a car idling too long outside wherever they were staying, nights she woke reaching for a child who was in fact asleep safely in the next room. 3 years of vigilance not so easily unlearned simply because the danger had finally been named and arrested. Minjun did not rush her through it. He learned slowly the difference between comforting someone and asking to be comforted in return, and chose, every time, the harder of the two. On the day the last of the legal proceedings against Seoyeon and Taehyun concluded, Minjun brought Amara the wedding ring she had left on the kitchen counter 3 years before. He had kept it absurdly in a drawer in every apartment and hotel room he'd occupied since, unable to sell it and unable to explain to himself why. He did not ask her to wear it again. He set it on the table between them, the same gesture she had once made in reverse, and told her the choice belonged entirely to her now. She did not touch it that night, but she did not throw it away either, and for the first time since the doorway, Minjun let himself believe that might be enough for now. Months later, in the same locked cabinet where she'd once kept the envelope that saved both their lives, Amara found a letter she hadn't opened, written by Minjun's father, dated before Minjun had ever met her, sealed inside the archive his father had built as insurance against a son he worried might one day become exactly what his own family had made him. One line in handwriting Minjun recognized instantly. "If my son ever loves a woman named Amara Bennett, trust her. She will save him from becoming me." Amara read it twice in the garden light and understood, finally, that the story had never simply been a tragedy dressed up as a betrayal. It had been a prediction, sealed shut for years, waiting for the two people it was written about to survive long enough to read it. She brought the letter to Min Jun that evening and watched him read it, standing at the same window where months earlier he had once demanded to know where she'd gotten a stolen bracelet. He read it twice the way she had, and then he folded it carefully and set it, without a word, into the small ceramic bowl on the terrace table, where they burned old paperwork from the foundation each week, not because the letter deserved to be destroyed, but because he wanted, deliberately, to close something. The flame took the corner first, curling the ink of his father's handwriting into smoke, and Amara did not stop him. Some things needed to be kept. This one, they both understood without saying so, needed to be finished. On a clear morning the following spring, in a garden that finally belonged to both of them, their daughter took her first steps across the grass toward nothing in particular, arms out for balance. The small silver bracelet, cleaned now, resized, worn without irony, catching the light at her wrist. Amara walked a few steps behind her, close enough to catch her, far enough to let her try. She wore that morning an old apron dusted faintly with flour from a cake she'd been teaching Minjun to make since dawn, an experiment that had ended with more batter on his sleeves than in the pan, and she was laughing. An unguarded, easy sound Minjun had not heard from her in the whole of their marriage, only now, on the other side of everything that had tried to end them. Kang Min-jun followed both of them, no security trailing him for the first time in his adult life, no rehearsed sentence dying in his throat, no reputation to defend. His sleeves were still dusted white with flour he hadn't bothered to brush off, and when their daughter stumbled and caught herself against his knee rather than falling, he crouched instinctively, arms open, the most feared man in Seoul reduced entirely and gladly to a father waiting to catch his little girl. When he looked up at Amara, there was no anger left in his eyes, only gratitude for the woman he had once believed destroyed his life and who had, in every way that mattered, been the one who saved it.